Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you guys are. Thank you for joining me. We are going to be looking at some material testing for the coefficient of friction. So the coefficient of friction, exactly what is that? What is it referring to? Well, Tom Cruise in Risky Business is showing us a demonstration of a low coefficient of friction between his socks and the polished wooden floor. So we can see it's quite slippery. So coefficient of friction is essentially, it's a descriptor of how slippery or how grippy something is, how slippery or grippy two surfaces that are in contact with one another is. I dare say if Tom's socks if he'd just come back from a run or it was a hot day and he attempted to do this, they wouldn't be very slippery. You know, moisture increases the coefficient of friction. And similarly, I would say if he tried to do this on his concrete driveway or on the bitumen road, it would also be a lot less slippery. So slipperiness is low coefficient of friction, grippy or traction is high coefficient of friction. When we are looking at all the different ways blister preventions can work, and we're looking at the coefficient of friction, it is literally this little corner of this chart. So what we're trying to do is we are trying to use two different materials that are more slippery against one another. Slip is the aim. It takes a bit of getting your head around, but slipperiness is the aim. It allows the bone to move the skin to move in sync with the bone at an earlier moment, and that reduces the magnitude of shear distortions. So we are completely looking at this little corner, ignoring all the other mechanisms for blister prevention. So what are the blister preventions that work on a reduced coefficient of friction? It's these ones. It's anything that is trying to keep the skin dry, because we know dry skin has a lower coefficient of friction with whatever it interfaces with generally. So that includes moisture-wicking socks. I'll let you decide whether moisture-wicking socks keep our skin, the bone, dry that's required for low friction. I think it's fair to say that, especially in an exercising capacity, the skin is always a little bit damp and clammy, which is high coefficient of friction or higher than dry skin. But anyway, all the skin drying strategies, moisture wicking socks, breathable shoes, they're trying to get the moisture out, changing out of wet socks, antiperspirants, powders, these are all aiming for drier skin, because we know that dry skin has a lower coefficient of friction. Lubricants also reduce the coefficient of friction. They make it more slippery, which is quite understandable. Double socks, the aim here is that the sock interface is slipperier than either the sock shoe or the sock skin interface. And ego blister patches work exclusively for a lower coefficient of friction, so they make it slippery between the sock and shoe. When we are trying to make things slippery, it has a blister prevention effect. But generally, making things slippery is not the aim. So if we have a look at these red arrows here, so these are all the areas where we have a material interface, and every material interface has a coefficient of friction. So the material interface between the ground and the outsole of the shoe, that is generally tuned to be a high coefficient of friction. We need grip for the efficiencies of gait. And then within the shoe, we've got a sock shoe interface, and we've got a skin sock interface. Similar at the back of the heel, we've got a skin sock interface and a sock shoe lining interface. Same at the dorsum of the toes, blah, blah, blah. So all of these have a specific coefficient of friction. Within the shoe, generally the aim is middle ground between low friction enough that you can slide your socked foot into the shoe without too much drama. I don't know if you've ever tried putting a neoprene Spenco insole upside down with the black stuff facing up. It grips against your sock and you can barely get your foot in. So that's why they put the lower friction cover on the top. But at the same time, no one's really trying to make it very slippery in there because it degrades the mechanical efficiencies of gait. So, and that is a legitimate thing to do. Really, the only reason why we would want to significantly reduce the coefficient of friction is where we have a shear-related skin lesion, calluses, painful calluses, blisters, ulcers even. These are all shear-related skin lesions. So different things work in different ways, but essentially it's important to realize that we have several material interfaces. Multiple interfaces are established when an individual places their foot inside a sock and then inside a shoe. Each interface has its own coefficient of friction, and slip will occur where there is the lowest coefficient of friction. So in terms of blister prevention, the aim is, if this is a metatarsal head, that is the skin surface. Generally, high friction keeps this stationary, the skin surface stationary, while the bone moves back and forth. Same thing at the back of the heel, and same thing at the dorsum of the toes. But if we think about a metatarsal head, the aim here for blister prevention, if we're trying to affect a lower coefficient of friction, is to lower the friction here, so the skin will slip and be able to move in sync with the bone at an earlier moment, thereby reducing the magnitude of those shear distortions. So if we have a closer look at these interfaces, the bone is way up out of screen at the top, and that's the thing that initiates the shear, the bone movement in the presence of high friction. So we've got the epidermis here that undergoes shear deformation, and then our interface is between the skin surface and the sock. So we've got one interface there. We've got an interface between the sock and the insole. And then we have an interface between the ground and the outsole. Now, with the material testing that I did, I looked at several of these interfaces. So I've got a bunch of tapes or adhesive products that we stick to the skin, hoping for a blister prevention effect. So what we're doing here is, when we apply Fix-A-Mall or rigid sports tape or paper tape or any of these, and we stick them to the skin, we are trying to change the skin sock interface into a tape sock interface. One thing, these measurements that I've done that I'm presenting today, one thing they don't do is tell us what the prevailing skin sock interface is, because I didn't have enough skin to peel off and stick onto these things that I was testing. So that's a significant limitation. We don't know what it is to start with, let alone what we're changing it to. But what this will show is the difference between these tapes against several socks. So that's the skin sock interface. Then I looked at some other materials, the types of things that we use as insoles, or we stick to insoles, or orthotics. So vinyl, Engo patches, Spenco, and Poron. So these are the things that typically interface or can interface with the sock. And I tested 3 sock conditions. Sorry, 3 double sock conditions. So we've got 6 test socks against these 3 socks, which are going to mean that we're testing double socks. So I used a cotton sock, a nylon stocking, and an armor skin sock. And then a couple of random things. Silicone gel, we use that a lot, and you'll find that that has a very high coefficient of friction. And I'll talk about that a bit more later. And wool. So loose packed wool is just wool that you kind of put your sock on and you stuff it between the sock and the skin. So they're kind of like a skin sock interface. So these are all the interfaces that we've looked at. So the yellow is the tapes. These are the insole or orthotic covers, our double socks, and our other 2 products. Now, the test socks that I used, there were 6 of them. So I went for, when I started this, I was just going to literally use cotton, because most other coefficient of friction testing uses cotton alone. But that's not very indicative of the athletic situation. But anyway, I sell PhysiPod socks, cotton socks at my practice. My patients love them, not so much the athletic type, but the more sedentary with swelling, because they're like a circulation sock. They don't cut in at the top. So we tested the 85% cotton sock, a moisture-wicking Thorlo sock, the Injinji Coolmax sock. This was the sport type, so they have the highest amount of Coolmax. We used a Smart Wool woolen sock, the Stegen nylon sock, because more than one person has said that these are good for blister prevention. And True Socks, don't know if you know about these, but these ones are built for high coefficient of friction. They're built for grip. They're used by soccer players, footy players, and netballers. And they have these little silicone rectangular bits both on the outside of the sock and also the inside of the sock. So it interfaces with the skin and the shoe surface. So really, really built for grip. This is kind of what things look like. So I'll show you the video in a sec, but these are all the materials that we tested. And this is an example of the sock. So I have these big nuts. They're 10 centimeters square. They're 2.3 kilos in weight. And I put a sock around it, one of these 6 socks. And then I tilted this. So this is called the inclined plane method. You tilt the test material, and I recorded that with my phone. And from there, you can figure out what the coefficient of friction is. So let's just play this. There's no sound on this. These little planks of wood are samples that you can get from Bunnings for just over $1. So I got a bunch of them and applied the test materials to them. That's the loose packed wool. And then our double socks, nylon stocking, armor skin sock, and our silicone gel. That's the gel facing upwards. And this is an example of the nut that I had that I got from the wreckers. I had 3 of them, and that's just showing you some socks that they were on. And the Smart Wool sock. Again, there are our test socks. So I just got my phone and with a bubble level and did some relatively rough measurements. I just plonked the sock covered nut onto the tape or the plank of wood that had the test material, and then tilted it to the point where we got the first little bit of movement. And that's the angle that I read there. So I did that a couple of times and just kind of got an average in whole numbers what that angle was. So I just wanted to take you through all these so you can kind of get a gauge of like the level of tilt required or the angle of that inclined plane for the different things. And then I've got all of these results tabulated, so we'll go through them. That one's felt. I think that one's moleskin, Hapla moleskin, that one. I use duct tape as well because some people like to use duct tape on their skin. Not that it's medical grade adhesive, I don't recommend it. The silicone, watch how much tilt this one needs. This one like toppled over if you weren't careful. That's how sticky silicone is. So really high coefficient of friction. The jig that I made for this was just 2 bits of wood that were at a right angle, and I just put some double-sided tape there to keep everything kind of stable, so that when I tilted the whole thing, everything tilted to the same angle. This is the cotton sock. I really should have double-sided taped that to its little plank of wood, but I didn't. It was kind of hard to get that sock over it, so I had to kind of try and eliminate the amount of stretch that was happening within the sock that wasn't actual relative movement at that interface. It's vinyl. This one's the Engo patches. Very small amount of tilt required to get movement on that one. Spanko. This one's smooth PPT or pour-on, the smooth side. And this one's abraded, and look at the tilt required on this one. So really high coefficient of friction on the abraded pour-on. And then finally wool, again, I had to kind of hold that so there was no deformation within all the fibers of the wool, that I was literally just getting the slip between those two interfaces. Okay, so that was that. Here are the results. These are the tapes. These are the orthotic or insole covers, our double socks, and our other two little products. And these are our test socks. So I've color-coded all these. It's a bit of a dog's breakfast, hard to read. It kind of comes out better here. So there are a few takeaways from this. Number one, Engo or shear band is down here. So clearly the lowest coefficient of friction. So I only needed to tilt that about 7, 8 degrees, 9 degrees before we got movement. All the other ones were predominantly in the 20 to 30 degree range before we got tilt. Now over here you can see the coefficient of friction. So this is the static coefficient of friction. That's what I was measuring, not the dynamic coefficient of friction. And you can literally just calculate it from the angle of inclination. So the coefficient of static friction is equal to the tangent of the angle just before the object begins to slide. And I literally just opened up an app calculator thing on the internet and plugged in that angle, and it gave me the coefficient of friction. So first of all, the Engo shear band PTFE was the lowest by far. The highest was silicon, or the silicon gel, followed closely behind by the abraded pour-on. Another couple of things that are takeaways here is if you look at the True Socks, which is this kind of light blue, they kind of exist more at the top. So remember, this is the sock that is designed for grip. I mean, over here, I mean, they're towards the top, but maybe middle to top. So not exactly the highest friction against the double socks and the orthosis covers, although it is for the Engo patches and the vinyl, but definitely the tapes, there was a high coefficient of friction, the highest coefficient of friction of the other test socks. The other thing that I have noticed here is the Stegen sock, which is the pink, tends to be at the lower end of these measurements, especially for the tapes. And we're at the lower end, but, so kind of on a par. So a tendency for a lower coefficient of friction. So they're the things that I took away. The high coefficient of friction test material the highest was silicon gel, followed closely behind by the pour-on abraded side, and the lowest was the Engo patches. The other takeaway, as I mentioned, the highest coefficient of friction test sock was the True Socks, and the lowest was the Stegen. They tended to be towards the lower end. The third takeaway that I wanted to discuss was the dynamic coefficient of friction. Now, we tested the static coefficient of friction. The difference is static coefficient of friction is when there is no relative movement between those two surfaces, and the kinetic coefficient of friction or the dynamic coefficient of friction is the friction when there is movement, so to maintain movement. The important thing to know here is this peak, which occurs in a state of static friction. So this is kind of a proxy for the magnitude of shear deformation, is where this peaks. The dynamic coefficient of friction is less important, and if anything, we've got less chance of blistering when there is relative movement. It will depend on exactly what level that is in comparison to the individual's, I guess, threshold for blistering, which is kind of a theoretical concept. I'm not saying we know what that is or anything, or I don't even know if we can measure it. But it's all about static friction. Static friction, when everything is still, that is going to determine peak shear. The aim of blister prevention when we are looking for a reduced coefficient of friction mechanism is to get movement earlier. So if this was Engo patches, for example, So there would be no slip, and then slip happens at a relatively low level of tilt. And then we've got the dynamic or kinetic friction there. So the static friction component, rather than it being here for the black graph at the top, it's now only this very slight part of the equation. We're getting slip earlier, and therefore the peak of that shear deformation has been reduced. One thing I noticed it surprised me that the duct tape had a relatively high coefficient of friction. I'll just slip to here. Duct tape is this one. So it's kind of definitely within the ballpark of all the other tapes. But one thing I noticed with the duct tape was once we reached that peak shear, it really slipped. It just sort of took off. So it was a much lower kinetic coefficient of friction than a lot of the other products. A lot of them, like Spenco and Felt, it was just a very gradual slip as we just crossed that threshold for kinetic friction. Whereas as soon as I'd crossed that threshold for the duct tape, it just slipped right off. Again, not as important for blister prevention because we've still had to reach that peak shear deformation, which is the determinant that we're interested in. I'll have a copy of these images that you'll be able to look closer at on the replay on the Pro Blister Prevention site. So don't try and squint too hard. I'll have that available for you. Now, obviously, limitations for these measurements. Number one, we're only assessing dry conditions, and really that is not indicative of an athletic situation. It is not indicative of anything to do with blisters, but it just gives us some preliminary data to, I guess, pique your interest. We also were unable to test the skin coefficient of friction. So when we were looking at the tapes, we could compare one tape to another, but we couldn't compare it to the prevailing skin sock coefficient of friction. And there are likely more accurate ways of measuring this. So there's something called the horizontal pull method. This is kind of instrumented, and it would be great to have access to that piece of equipment. Existing coefficient of friction data, if you wanted to go back and have a look at anything, we've got the study by Sanders and colleagues from 1998. They are in the orthotic and prosthetic space. So they use some materials like Spenco and Poron and some other materials that I'm not quite so familiar with, because they're looking at more amputation sites and prosthetic limbs. They looked also at the skin coefficient of friction. So they were using the anterior tibia. So yeah, that's quite interesting. They used a wool sock. A couple of takeaways from that: they demonstrated that it's definitely worth wearing a sock compared to not wearing a sock, which we all do generally, except if you maybe a triathlete and you're trying to save time, so you go sockless, or if you're in a situation where the fashion dictates that socks or hosiery of any description is not the go. And they also found that the lowest coefficient of friction tended to be between the skin and the sock. So that is where slip or rubbing is most likely to occur. There's also some data from Polyak and Scheinberg. They came up with this Bursatec bandage, which is a blister dressing. I've never actually seen these in real life. I don't really know if they're even available still. But anyway, they tested the coefficient of friction of a number of other dressings, and theirs was a very low coefficient of friction compared to the others. And this one was a great one by Marty Carlson. This is the guy that has invented Engo and shear band, which is the PTFE material. So they did some in-house testing. It was published in this journal. And the interesting thing about this one is it compared different moisture levels. So bone dry, 0% water to 100% water by weight. So they just gradually increased moisture to the sock until, and then weighed it to determine what the percentage of moisture was. And they found that the Ango patches was consistently, the coefficient of friction was around 0.2, compared to Spenco is the red up the top. So it increased as moisture was added. The Plastosote in the green remained relatively stable, but was about 2 to 2.5 times higher coefficient of friction compared to the Ango patches. And the Poron or PPT was the yellow one. So a little bit of moisture, it increased fairly rapidly. And then from about 30 to about 80, it remained relatively stable and then increased again. So it would be really great to be able to replicate this with all of those more podiatry focused materials and different socks. This was a cotton sock from memory. There was some other data that I had seen from these authors where they measured socks and determined how much moisture was in them from athletes that have just been doing their thing and took their socks off and they weighed them. And the moisture content was, I think it was 10% for one, it was 3 people, 10%, something like 25% and 30%. And yeah, so around about the 30% is where you want to be looking at generally in an athletic sense. So again, we have literally just been looking at one mechanism of action to attain blister prevention, that is reducing friction force by pairing materials that are more slippery against one another than grippy. We've ignored all these other mechanisms. That's not to say that these don't hold any weight. For example, gel toe sleeves, that gel material absorbs shear. We've just seen that it has a very, very high coefficient of friction, but I use these a lot for toe blisters because the material undergoes shear itself. It undergoes shear deformation, so there's less shear left to happen within the skin. So by all means, you can have a very high coefficient of friction material, but it can still prevent blisters via another mechanism. Spenco insoles is another one. The Spenco undergoes shear, less shear that's left to happen within the skin. Now, if this is kind of a new concept for you, then I can recommend that you enroll in Blister Prevention University. That is a course that goes through all of these mechanisms and shows you how all of the strategies fit into this, and also takes you through blister prevention strategies specific to anatomical locations, which really is the key for truly effective blister prevention. Is not just thinking of blisters as one thing requiring one solution. It is dependent on what's going on with the bone movement and like the anatomical location. Okay, 2 minutes for Q&A. So Scott asked me a question from last month that I didn't get to. Best blister care for children with blisters who have been diagnosed with EB. Well, if you are of the opinion, which I'm sure you are, that blisters, including EB blisters, are an injury of shear, so they're a shear-related injury, then the aim is to minimize shear. We can do that in a number of ways. We can reduce the amount of bone movement, because these things are really at the core of creating shear. It's bone movement in the presence of high friction force. It's this mismatch in movement. So the bone moves, the skin can't move because of high friction, or at least it can't move for a prolonged period within that single step. And therefore the magnitude or the angle of these lines, which represents the magnitude of shear, is higher. So there's bigger shear distortion. So we can change the way the bone moves if that's relevant to the anatomical location. We can reduce friction force, so we get slip somewhere. We can also reduce friction force by reducing pressure. So it really depends on what's happening, what shoe this person's in, what their mechanics is like, and all that kind of thing. I would be reluctant to encourage slip between the sock and the skin for someone with EB. So if I was reducing the coefficient of friction, I would be trying to encourage that slip to happen between the sock and the shoe. Just less chance of skin trauma. If the dynamic coefficient of friction is above the threshold for blisters, then we've eliminated that, because any slippage is happening between the skin and the sock rather than being abrasive to the skin. A lot of EB revolves around big bulky dressings or bandaging, and really the way that works is it probably absorbs shear. So all those layers of bandage undergo a bit of shear themselves, a bit like Spanko and the gel toe sleeves to a lesser degree, and they would reduce pressure because they're spreading the pressure out instead of it being at a bony prominence. I would be reluctant to be sticking things to the skin any more than I had to, just because there's the potential to cause skin damage when you remove them. Really, the number of repetitions is, it doesn't take many repetitions with people with EB to cause blisters. So we're probably already minimizing activity as it is. And if anything, what we want to do is encourage the ability for this person to be able to walk more and do more stuff and not get blisters by making the most of all of these strategies. And essentially EB it's just saying that the skin's internal resilience to shear deformation is much lower than your average person by far. So this is very, very low. So again, this is low. We want to maximize the activities of daily living and being active. So we have to do everything that we can here to reduce the magnitude of shear distortions. And it could involve any of this. So yeah, if that's a bit of a head spin to you and you don't really know where to start, I always, with every blister that I see, I'm thinking about where is it on the foot and what is relevant here in terms of pressure from the bones, bone movement, what I can implement in terms of blister, in terms of coefficient of friction relief, and spreading and absorbing shear, what materials I can add purposefully to reduce the magnitude of those shear deformation. Robin asked, how can marathoners keep their skin comfortable and intact during events? So I'm really just going on blisters here, Robin, rather than just general comfort. But one thing that we don't want to encourage or facilitate is this over-reliance on hope, luck, and bravado. This is what our patients are doing now, because they have tried to make sense of blister prevention. It hasn't worked. And so they think, oh, she'll be right, or, you know, it's not as hot this time, or, you know, whatever. They really don't know. They're all at sea. So they really do need our guidance on this. And our guidance needs to be based on a good understanding of all the mechanisms for shear reduction. And literally that is based on an understanding of what causes blisters, the factors that go into it. Bone movement in the presence of high friction force, and obviously the repetitions. And it really depends, Robin, on the anatomical location of these blisters. It's important to try and get away from thinking about blisters as one entity requiring one solution. There's no single shoe, there's no single sock, there's no single anything that's going to be the right or the best intervention for a blister on all parts of the foot. So we really do need to get anatomically specific, and that's what we do in Blister Prevention University. Is I give you my understanding based on my experience for all of these areas. Andrew asks about bamboo socks. How do they rate? I really don't know, Andrew. I haven't seen really that much on bamboo socks. I hear conflicting things about bamboo socks, like are they actually bamboo for a start? One thing we know is they tend to hold a lot of water. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, debatable, because the thing with wool is it holds some water within the fibers of the wool. That seems to be a good thing for wool, but a bad thing for cotton. So I don't know. Socks are a really conflicting topic when it comes to blister prevention. And I have spoken about socks in depth in previous episodes, so perhaps have a look at those presentations. But bamboo, I don't know. As soon as I know something, I'll probably have something to say about it because everyone wants to know. Nanette is our last question. Is poor fitting footwear the main cause of blisters? No, I wouldn't say it's the main cause of blisters. I would say it's more common in a person's early entry into athletic activity. But it's something that people tend to optimize pretty soon when they realize they just can't get away with tight shoes or shoes that are too big or don't fit properly. But no, I mean, one thing that you will see in non-podiatry circles is just this assumption that if you continue to get blisters, you've got the wrong shoes, but no one can look at the shoe and tell you exactly what's wrong with it, what the actual component of that shoe is that is wrong that you should look to avoid when you buy your next pair of shoes. And this leads to people just buying shoe after shoe after shoe at the shoe shop and returning and getting refunds on these shoes because the shoe shop likes to think that they don't sell shoes that cause blisters. But no, it's often not the shoe, and you have to look outside of that if you want to affect really good blister prevention. And also consider that people with bunions and hammer toes and Haglund's deformity, they will never get the perfect fitting shoe. No shoe is going to come with the exact right shoe, not in an athletic sense anyway. So I would say no, unless you are buying shoes based on the aesthetics of them, the price of them, and that's leading you to make poor decisions, I would say it is not a common cause. One thing I will caveat with that is shoe fit really is dependent on lacing. At ultramarathon, I see people, when it gets a bit hot and their feet start to swell, they undo the laces, toes end up at the end of the toe box, and all of a sudden we get a lot of toe blisters. So we do at all times need to optimize the perfectly sized shoe so that our foot remains in the right place in the shoe. Because you can have a perfectly sized shoe, perfectly fitting shoe, but if your laces are all loose, as far as your toes are concerned, that shoe is 3 sizes too small for them. So yeah. Okay, if any of that is new to you, if you'd like to delve further into blister prevention, I can recommend Blister Prevention University. It's a course that Doug and I created kind of off the back of our literature review and expertise in blister management. And you can just Google it, or you can go over to our pro site. This is really for podiatrists, this site. And anyone in the health arena that is helping people, or athletic arena that's helping people with their blisters. Pro.blister-prevention. The Learn tab has our replays of office hours. Earn is where you can get onto our wholesale into our wholesale prices for the products that we sell, and you'll find Blister Prevention University under courses. So that is it, guys. If there are any questions, either shout out or put them in the chat box and I shall answer them right now. No messages in the chat. I'll just give you another minute or two. If anyone's interested in getting a bit of research, a research project up, I think it would be great to replicate this with all of the materials that podiatrists are used to, like the ones that I've done today. Just gradually increasing the moisture component to the sock and measuring the coefficient of friction, and perhaps using this horizontal pull method. So, I mean, I don't know if you can just buy this instrumentation or what the story is, but I'm sure there are labs that have them. And using an array of socks, an array of materials. I think that would be fascinating. You're welcome, Sandra. Thank you, Nanette. Thank you for your question too. All right, guys, so that looks like it's about it. Feel free to get in contact if you do have any questions. Have you found that the Injinji socks help with reducing toe blisters? Injinji toe socks stand to really only have any effect on interdigital blisters. No other toe blisters, maybe pinch blisters, but really the difference between those socks compared to any other sock is they're turning an interdigital skin interface into a sock interface. And it's also putting 2 extra layers of padding and material that has the potential to deal with moisture when normally there is nothing. So interdigital blisters, yes, they can be very effective at preventing interdigital blisters. I find not as effective as gel toe sleeves or gel toe caps, particularly for pinch blisters and particularly on the little toe that really can kink in and under. But where you just need a little bit of interdigital protection for all the interdigital spaces, definitely toe socks. With the gel toe sleeves, you can really only fit 1 or 2 on per foot, so it can't sort of protect all of those areas. But yes, definitely it's a good entry point. If you're getting interdigital blisters, definitely try the Injinji toe socks. They come in different thicknesses. So the ultra, I think it's ultra. Yeah, ultra. They are thicker between the toes and some of the others are thinner between the toes. There's another, the Injinji are generally a moisture-wicking sock, so they have the Cool Max. There are a couple of wool ones, but not many. There is another brand of toe sock that out now that is called Creepers. And the difference with these is they are wool. So they're 50% wool, I think. And I'm finding that the ultra marathon runners that I have a lot to do with, they are shifting from Injinji to Creepers. I'd love to be selling Creepers on my website. I can't because they're prioritizing bricks and mortar stores. But as soon as they open things up, I'll definitely have the woolen Creepers socks on my website. So if you've got any ultra marathon runners out there or anyone doing something endurance like multi-day hiking, if they aren't getting on too well with the Injinji, get them trying some wool Creepers and see how they go. And if there's one toe in particular that they really need to prioritize, the gel toe sleeves and caps tend to work better for that individual toe. You're welcome, Sandra. All right, guys, really thank you for being online today, and it was lovely to see everyone at the APOD conference last week. I ran into a lot of people that I haven't met before, so thanks for coming and saying hi. I had a poster presentation there. It was a great conference, and yeah, I guess I'll see all you guys in a couple of years at the next one. In the meantime, you'll get this replay on our pro site. It'll be up either later today or tomorrow. Any questions, give me an email and I shall see you soon.